Infidelity is a tsunami in a relationship. It blows everything apart, and you will end up either without a relationship or a new relationship because otherwise you'll be stuck in the same thing. And generally, if people survive, they're going to take it down to the basement level and rebuild and have a new relationship.
Hello, everyone. My name is Steven, and this is my wife, Leigh. We are here at the Unlocking Love Summit, and we have with us today Jennifer Lear. Jennifer Lear is a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in educating couples on the relationship skills they need to build a secure, connected, and loving partnership. She is also the founder of Reconcile, an app to help improve relationships, and she is the host of the Yearning Heart podcast, where she talks with everyday people about their relational journeys, learning, and growth. She has had advanced training in many modalities and uses her knowledge to help others. Jennifer has been helping couples for over 20 years. She has 2 blogs which are designed to help people improve their lives and relationships: Reconcile's blog and Jennifer's blog, as well as other media. Jennifer Lear also writes and talks about her journey, her own personal journey from a difficult relational beginning to creating a beautiful relationship with her husband. And Jennifer, we are so very excited to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm happy to be talking with you guys. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Jennifer, I want to get right into it. The last time we spoke, you had brought up this concept that I wanted to touch on with you a bit more. And you had said that we are drawn to the person that can heal our deepest wounds and help finish our deepest unfinished business. I
Mhm.
was hoping that you could speak more on that, where that comes from, and what that actually looks like.
So this idea, I don't know if it predates Harville and Helen Hendricks, and they're the founders of Imago Therapy, but I know this is a premise of theirs that we all have childhood wounds, places where we did not get what we needed. For instance, we might have been angry and our parent did not help us process our anger, or we might have been sad and our parent did not. And so because of those gaps between what we actually needed to, because we're wiring as we're developing, and because of those gaps, we end up with wounds. A really quick example is I was in a grocery store once, this is quite a while ago, and a mother was screaming at her, probably 5-year-old, and he was just sobbing. And I thought, oh my God, what's this poor kid going to be like in a relationship when he's older? He's not going to be able to, he's going to be angry. He's not going to be able, because nobody listened to his frustration and didn't help him process it. So anyway, so that's an example. But Harville and Helen Hendricks came up with this idea that we draw into our lives people that will activate our wounds and they give us the opportunity to heal them. And I've seen this happen with people. I did a podcast, I think it was episode 7, and the whole conversation was about how until she did a certain amount of work on herself, she kept drawing in these people who activated specific wounds, but they didn't have the capacity to help her heal it. And then she eventually drew in someone with a much more secure upbringing. And because he won't run away and abandon her, she's starting to heal. But so this is interesting. She drew, there's still triggers and stuff we worked out, but she finally healed enough that she drew in someone she could work it out with.
So would you say that we're drawing in these people on an energetic level, subconscious level? How do you see that really happening? Like, what is going on there?
I think it's unconscious. It just feels like a fit. Like, why it just feels like, oh. And then later you discover all these horrible things that you're feeling because you actually were unconsciously drawn to something to help you finish your unfinished business. Yeah. I don't think it's conscious at all.
So when you say unfinished business, can you explain a little bit more about what that means? Because it sounds so, you know,
Yeah.
I can't think of the word. It sounds so final. It sounds so
Yeah.
intense.
Let's see, how would I word this? So let's suppose I have a wound where I don't feel like anyone ever listens to me because nobody listened to me when I was a child. And so I'll draw in people who don't listen to me, or they'll activate that. They might not even, they're not consciously not listening to me, but they are not paying attention, or their focus is somewhere else. And all of a sudden I feel like, you never listen to me. Well, as soon as you say always or never, you're dealing with a wound. Those are red flags for you're dealing with a wound. You never listen to me means you're doing something to me that I can't stand, and it feels like it's omnipotent, and you have to like sort of scream it out because you can't stand it. So that would be an example of a wound that got activated. And then you have to figure out how to navigate through that with the person who, quote unquote, is wounding you. And they have to become sensitized to the wound you have so they can start helping you. They can say, I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Could you say it again? And then I would also feel like, oh, okay, that's okay. They actually are interested. It was just a mishap, but it alerted me to this part of me that doesn't feel listened to.
So, I mean, I'm just interested in the case of infidelity. So, I mean, what you're saying is that all of these wounds are already there, right? And then they get activated, and then there's this big blow up, maybe an infidelity, a betrayal. Is that always just activating an old wound, or are there new, or can we get wounded past the age of childhood, or is it all?
Yeah, no, there are new wounds. So you have attachment wounds, I call them attachment wounds, that happen in childhood. And then you have wounds that happen in adulthood that could be traumatic and possibly connect to a childhood wound, or possibly just be a new horrible thing that has traumatized someone. Like being in a car accident. You might not have had one as a child, but one happens as an adult and you're still traumatized. And then that has to be healed. Often it'll link to childhood wounds, but not always.
Now, I mean, we're talking about these wounds that are being uncovered as we're young, as we're kids.
Right.
So like there's these wounds. You talk about this child in the grocery store who's just unable to be heard, and that stuff carries on throughout their life. So as a child, like what do you do? Like what do you start to do to like navigate through that? To put yourself in a position to like make yourself okay with the pain of not being heard, not being understood, not feeling like you're counted, you know?
I don't think children can do that much with it. I think they're stuck till they're older, unless they have a supportive other person who they can go to. And whether it's a therapist or a grandparent or an aunt, whatever, if they have someone they can go to and say, this is what happened, that person can help soothe them. But when you're a child, and I worked with children for a number of years, and it was some of the most depressing work I've done in my life, because you can't save them. You can give them a touchstone that they can sort of internalize and sort of draw on, but they can't possibly do that by themselves. I know my husband had a particularly violent father, and at the age of 8, he decided he was going to be the opposite of his father. So that was his strategy for survival. Now I won't go into it, but there are sides to that, and there are negative, consequences of that decision also, that, he would have to work out later in life to be more integrated, because otherwise you're just taking a hard black and white stance, and that's not an integrated place.
Yeah.
And then how does that play out in terms of because the child can't process, they're not equipped at that point.
Right.
And then they take on, adaptive defensive behaviors. It seems, I mean, children are very good at that, right? It's like, okay, this is what I need to become in order to survive this.
Right.
And subconsciously, right?
Yeah.
And then how does that play out? I know this feeds into your next question, but then how does that play out coming into an adult relationship? What does that look like?
Okay, well, we're getting into attachment styles right now. And so our defensive strategies are, that's embedded in this idea of attachment style. So if you were someone who was beaten as a child, for example, you're going to be left with this, I don't trust anyone. And also with, I crave connection, and I'm afraid of connection. Well, that you go into your adult relationship with that imago, back to imago therapy, and you're going to draw someone in who activate, first of all, you're probably picking people who aren't trustworthy, most likely. And they could be abandoning, or they could be, who knows, but there's a lot of scenarios, but they're going to activate all that. And until you get a handle on, oh my God, this is a pattern, this is what I'm doing, why is this happening like this, and start doing some of your own work. And I think, obviously relational work, some of it has to be done in relationship, but there's also work that can be done outside of relationship. And also, if you're in therapy, you're in a relationship, and a therapist can help heal because it's relational. But some of the work, I did a lot of work just through writing. And before I got fixed all the relational stuff, some of my own interpersonal, my intrapsychic work, not interpersonal, within what's going on in myself, I did a lot of that work outside of a relationship. But at some point, I switched into doing the work in the relationship because that's where I had to finish it.
So you mentioned writing. What other practices did you find essential for that individual part of it?
So what I did, I have an interesting history where I'd be in a bookstore and I'd see this book, and I'd just say, that book, I'd like grab it. There's some reason that book's calling to me, and it would be this great book that would help me. So I did a lot of work with Lucia Capacchione. Wrote books where recovery of the inner child, that kind of thing, where you are actually drawing, like you might draw the body, and the heart might say, oh, I feel broken, and the stomach might say, oh, I'm all tense. And you start finding out it starts connecting pieces. So you aren't a disconnected, disembodied head walking around. You actually become connected to all of yourself. So I did a lot of that. I did parts work. This is before internal family systems, which is now a thing, where I identified different parts of me and what they're like. I had an anxiety part that would be up on the ceiling, like not in my body because of my anxiety. And there were other parts that protected that part. Like we all have, and this is not dissociative identity disorder, because the central ego can communicate with all of them. It's when you have DID, there's a gap in the middle. The pieces, different pieces talk to different pieces, but not everybody knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But we all have parts, which is what the family systems therapy focuses on. But I identified a lot of parts, when they were formed, what formed them, what their purpose was, what their feeling was. And that I started me getting a better understanding of who I was as this complex being. Mm-hmm. And that was a really good skill for me to have. And then I did a lot of writing of my feelings, journaling, and getting the feelings out. What happens when we don't deal with our feelings is we push them into the basement. And they're down there festering. Let me out. And they're like 2 years old because they've been pushed down for a long time. They're not adult yet. So you have to write them out or find a way to express them so they can start maturing and have more perspective than the 2-year-old feeling self, which is what gets stuck down in the basement if you get rid of them.
That's such a beautiful description of that work. We were introduced to that idea through, like you said, internal family systems. And then come to find out, oh, this has been around forever. This has already been around, but it is kind of framed now in a way that has become a lot more popular and maybe palatable for a lot of people. Did you find that internal family systems filled a gap in there did it add anything to the parts work model you already working with?
So I haven't done enough work with internal family systems to really have. I haven't had the time to deeply go into like what are they offering that we didn't already have. So I actually don't know. I just know I have one or two of the books, and I have done some reading, but I haven't done enough to say, oh, this is new, or oh, they've improved this. So I don't actually know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in your experience, why was it helpful? You talk about being able to identify these different parts of yourself and the complexity involved with who I am as a human being, how complicated Steven is, how complicated Leigh is, how complicated Jennifer is. Why was that so important to be able to recognize that we're much more complicated than we think, and like and you talked about the maturing of the perspective through the writing process. Can you
Mhm.
speak a little bit more on what becomes available to you when you start identifying the different parts of ourselves and the emotions attached to those parts of ourselves?
Well, let's start with the opposite position of what happens if you don't do that.
Okay.
So you hear about people who are avoidant, or if you work with someone who's avoidant attachment style, or if you have an addiction, it's a similar thing. They're not that in touch, particularly avoidant, they're not that in touch with what are they really feeling? Like, they might have some surface feelings, I'm frustrated, I'm anger, but they won't be in touch with the deep longing or the feeling that maybe I'm not good enough, or there's deep stuff going on that they don't know about. So if you don't know about parts of yourself, you are acting like your partner might say, "So what are you feeling?" "I don't know." Well, you don't get very far in a relationship if you actually don't have some material to engage with. And you have to be able to engage with yourself, slow yourself down, know what's going on so you can communicate it to your partner. That's how you do a relationship. So the more you know about the different parts of yourself and how where you get triggered, what your survival strategies are, where you are weak, where you're strong, the more you have, there's more grist for the mill. There, you know yourself better, and you can be with your partner in a more complete way because you can say, "Oh, I'm really itching to go get a beer at the bar, but I need your support right now because I'm afraid I'm going to succumb and I don't want to." And the partner can talk it out with you and help you figure out that's just a very minor example, but um, if you have, let's suppose you're in a family crisis, like a stress thing that has nothing to do with your relationship. And one person needs a lot of support, and the other person isn't used to co-regulating. They go auto-regulate and they go off and desert their partner because they've got to get calmed down in themselves. But there's been no conversation about how they're going to manage this horrible, stressful situation and what each person needs. And the avoidant partner might have to say, "Look, I don't want to abandon you, but I need 20 minutes to go calm down, and then I'll come back and we'll talk." And the anxious partner can say, "Okay, I can live with that. I just need to know you're not going to disappear and leave me holding the bag here with this horrible, difficult situation."
Mm.
So you brought up, you've brought this up a few times in our talk today about survival strategies. What are some different survival strategies that people have when dealing with these difficult emotions and this trauma? And how do you think that those play a role leading up to infidelity and also after discovery?
Right. So start with the survival strategy part. Um, so a survival strategy could be shutting down,
Yeah.
Mm.
yelling, screaming, "I hate you." That could be a way of expressing frustration, but not expressing the vulnerable hurt underneath. So a survival strategy could be, using that can be, "I got to get out of my body. I can't feel what's going on. It's too intense for me." Or, "I don't want to be in touch with myself." Or emotional eating can be a survival strategy because we don't want to feel the stuff we haven't got a handle on. So there's many, many, many survival strategies. Any action at all that helps the person feel regulated, even if it isn't good for the relationship and actually ultimately isn't good for them, is a survival strategy. And eventually they can learn to get different self-talk. That's usually a new positive self-talk. You might have negative self-talk as a survival strategy. "I'm so horrible. I shouldn't have done that. Who do I think I am?" That stuff would have come from before. And if you start changing that to, "It's okay, this will pass, it's temporary," you're bringing in a cognitive level, a new survival strategy. So those are just some quick little examples. And now, how does that tie into infidelity? So infidelity occurs for various reasons. One reason is relational. And I may not know all the reasons. I'm going to cover the two that come to my mind right now. One is relational. There is a problem in the relationship, and the person who cheats doesn't want to be there. They don't want to deal with whatever's happening. Nobody's fault, But the survival strategy is get me out of here. I'm going to find something that feels better. There's also the relational stuff, a survival strategy of addiction, which usually predates the relationship. The person has addictive tendencies of some kind, and they fall into them as a way to avoid, whether it's themselves, closeness, conflict, differences. They fall into the addiction, which takes over, because an addiction is an addiction, it's going to take over. But the thing pushing them into it is some kind of avoidance or just a craving for a high. And relationships, when, the first 6 months can be a high, but sooner or later you hit dirt. It's not a high anymore. You've got work to do. And if you're stuck in needing the high, you're not going to necessarily stick around and do the work. And that is another, I call more addictive version of infidelity. So there's different, and the relational piece also comes in terms of the person who's being cheated on. Are they aware of what's going on? If not, why not? Is it because the partner is really good at tricking them? Is it because they're not paying attention? Is it because they've learned to not challenge? I mean, there's many, many possibilities that could cause, this to happen in a relationship, because it is a relational event, even though one person's doing it.
So when you're describing, because there's all this work, right? Once that high wears off, and then if you go hit infidelity, then you've got all of this, you've got so much more work, right? Because you've got these new wounds, you've got your previous wounds, everything's activated, everything's all out there needing your attention. What becomes available? What are the positives? What happens if you do stick around and do that work in a relational sense versus just like, okay, I'm done with this, I'm going to go seek out another high?
Right. So you're talking about the person who's cheating, seeking out the other high, more specifically?
Yeah. And then also the person who has been betrayed in terms of sticking it out, doing the work, becoming more relational, becoming more aware of themselves. Because when you're describing this high, it's like, oh, well, then I'll just go do that. Why do the hard stuff?
Right.
So what's the light at the end of the tunnel for people who are kind of on that path?
So, do you ever want to have a functioning relationship? It's the light. I mean, if you don't do the work, you're either going to keep drawing in the same pattern or you'll stay in the same situation, but you won't actually heal the old wounds, create a really secure connection. And what we're trying to create in our relationships are secure connections, secure attachment, so that we co-regulate each other, so we help each other heal, so we are there for each other instead of continual sense of abandonment or sense of being overwhelmed. And it's sort of about which box do you want to live in?
Yeah. And when you talk about co-regulating and helping each other heal, can you talk about what you mean, like really in terms of scientifically, how are we wired to co-regulate and help each other heal?
So Stan Tatkin is I think he's called a neuropsychologist. Anyway, Stan Tatkin is a training psychologist who I did some training with years ago. And he's a master at this. I think Dan Siegel does some work on this too, but co-regulation means our bodies are wired to feel. We'll go back to the mother holding the child. If you're holding the child will calm. If the child is crying and you put the child down and walk away, it will usually escalate because we're wired to be tuned in. The child's tuned into the parent, whatever parent is the caretaker who's nurturing, and that actually calms the whole physiology. So in adults, eye contact, hugging, touching, face to face, all of that is physiologically calming, as opposed to if you're yelling and screaming at each other, if you're avoiding eye contact, that is escalating and brings up feelings of despair and abandonment and overwhelm because you aren't getting what we need biologically, which is the biological, physiological attachment connection, which actually calms our whole nervous system down.
That's beautifully put. Yeah. Did you want to move on to your next question? Because
I mean,
I have a few written down, but I don't want to
I know,
take up all.
I know, I have so many questions that branch off of what you were just talking about, but I did want to leave us some time, because we're talking about these survival strategies, and all of this is kind of happening at a subconscious level. So what, like, we don't know that we're in a survival strategy. We don't know that we're driven to respond or react to a situation or a person because of something that has happened before in our past. We don't realize that we're reacting. We think we're making rational, logical decisions.
Mhm.
How do we recognize when we are operating in a survival strategy?
Okay, that's a good question. And I want to actually question that question a little, which is when you are triggered, do you really feel that you're operating in a rational, logical way?
I would say sometimes.
Or what's happening that you can be triggered and go to the rational? I'm just curious, what's happening?
I wouldn't, maybe not rational, I would say justified and entitled.
Right. Okay. Logical, rational.
Not lot, but it disguises itself as
Right.
logical, rational,
Right. So
but it's really justified and entitled.
for you, if you're feeling justified and entitled, you know you're triggered and it's something
Mm,
you need to look at. And
right,
that's specific to you.
right.
Because different people have different places they go. I don't go to justified and entitled. I go to somewhere else, but Lee probably goes somewhere else also. But that for you would be, oh, I'm feeling this way. What's going on? What's going on underneath that defensive structure? Because that's a defensive structure to keep you a wall around you, keep you separate, and keep you safe.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And even just recognizing, oh, I'm feeling this way. I feel like so many people can't even get there,
Mhm.
right? Which is that's kind of like the starting point, right? Is being aware that this is, oh, I'm feeling this way. Like Steven said, it just seems like who I am. Like,
Mhm.
and this is just
Right. So I'm going to bring up just a really quick little piece from the app, the We Can Tell app. So there's a topic in there called understanding each other and understanding ourselves, I believe. Anyway, I break it down into lenses. When a triggering event occurs, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What's happening in your body? What are you seeing? Like images, like, and it walks you through. I believe I have 12 lenses, 12 different windows to look at yourself. Well, so that you can actually, so that what we need to, and hence the earlier work with the Lucia Cappuccione book, where Recovery of the Inner Child, which is connecting you to what's happening in my body. What am I imagining? What words? What am I thinking? What's happening in my microcosm in that moment? And all the senses are involved. And people, when you're in an entitled, uh, whatever the word you said, of place, judgmental, entitled place, you're only in your brain. You're probably not aware. My chest just constricted. I'm seeing an image of this. I'm feeling like tight. Like that's not part of the picture. Well, that's what you have to develop. And that's true. A lot of people don't have a huge internal repertoire of what's going on developed. And I mean, if you want to be a complete human, it's sort of part of the deal.
So, and I feel like you're starting to kind of get into this. So we've talked about like the recognition and bringing about the awareness of what's actually going on, identifying, just like in my example, identifying that entitlement, that justification process that's happening in my mind is disconnecting me from the rest of my body. And there's more to the story than just what's happening up here. So how do we get out of the survival strategies now that we are aware, now that we have started the process of, okay, I realize that I am feeling entitled, I'm feeling justified, I am feeling right. And I'm like, okay, Now I'm aware that for me, that is a red flag. And I'm starting to notice the tightness in my chest. I feel like myself shrinking. So I feel the need to get big with my entitlement and my justification and my righteousness to protect myself. How do I get out?
Well, we get into this as a practice, but just specifically for you, what does that relate to when you were a kid, where you had that feeling that you weren't right, and then you had to find that place where, wait, I am right. You can't do that. So you would start connecting the dots and go, oh, that is coming from this specific pattern or this specific event in my childhood. And then you also start going, I'm okay, I'm aware. I think the 12-step slogan is awareness, acceptance, action. So you have to become aware. Then you have to accept this is what it is. You're wired this way. You're not just going to snap your fingers and be different. And then the action is ongoing. It's a process where you continue to develop the ability to catch yourself sooner, to talk about what's going on sooner, to, whether it's an internal dialogue or a dialogue with the partner or a therapist. And it's a process. That's why therapy generally takes more than one session.
If only it were that simple.
Right.
So, do you have anything?
You can go ahead.
Yeah.
I
So,
know you have a couple more.
well, I mean, I know that we're getting short on time here. And before we end, I wanted to ask you, is there anything else that's on your heart that you would like to leave the audience with today?
Well, in terms of the actual surviving infidelity, there's two things. One is the person who cheated, we'll call it the cheater, not a very good name, but has to be willing to feel the pain in their own selves that they caused. So the I'm sorry has to come from, I feel your pain and it pains me.
Right.
That has to happen. And often what happens is the person who cheats is very defensive because they haven't had any healing. They've just moved into this defensive strategy of cheating, and they aren't ready to go into they aren't able actually to go into their internal experience yet and go and open up enough that they can say, oh my God, I created such pain and it hurts me to have created such pain. So to be aware that it's repairing a relationship. Infidelity is a tsunami in a relationship. It blows everything apart, and you will end up either without a relationship or a new relationship, because otherwise you'll be stuck in the same thing. And generally, if people survive, they're going to take it down to the basement level and rebuild and have a new relationship. And part of that with the partner who's, I would say, more avoidant is both partners need to really get more in touch with who they are, what their feelings are, and learn how to communicate the vulnerable feelings. And that takes a while. They also have to recognize the cycle. When this happens, I act out this way, or when she does that, I act out this way, but then that triggers her to act out that way, and we have a cycle. That has to be deconstructed, and then you have to get into the feelings underlying those actions so that they can start breaking the pattern. Does that make sense?
That's so beautifully put. I guess I'm always curious about this. Why are we so afraid of our feelings? Why do we think they'll kill us?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I'm not sure, but it's historical. I mean, we have as cultures, certainly as our culture, try to stay away. I mean, just the term crybaby. Why can't we cry? Why do we have to be these stoic? I mean, just send our kids off to boarding school. They don't get, I mean, the history is very anti-feeling in a lot of places. I'm sure there's probably places that aren't, but I don't know. I just think I believe ultimately if we get to the male and female, the divine feminine, the divine masculine, the qualities of logic and rationality have been elevated above body, sensation, and intuition and feelings, or the more feminine qualities. And to make the world work, we have to have those on the same level.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Jennifer, I mean, it's been such a pleasure to speak with you today, and I do want to take a moment to just thank our audience for watching. Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was great talking to you both. I had fun.